Hello and welcome to the third episode of Talking Burma by the Burma Canadian Association of Ontario. On this episode, we have Isabella Aung. Isabella Aung is a doctoral candidate in political studies at Queen's University. Her research focuses on how contemporary authoritarian power is both contested and sustained through social media and gender. Born in Myanmar, Isabella migrated to the United States as a young teen. She later moved to Canada to pursue her graduate studies, where she is currently a UBC Myanmar Initiative Fellow, a Civil War Paths Fellow at the University of York, an inaugural Public Scholarship Fellow at Queen's University, a Conference of Defense Associations Institute Fellow, and a Myanmar Policy and Community Knowledge Hub Fellow at the University of Toronto. She's also head of the Comparative Politics Diploma Program at Spring University, Myanmar, which provides youth in and from Myanmar access to university-level education during this political crisis. Please welcome Isabella Aung.
Thank you for having me.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are beyond the bio and what you do today?
So my name is Isabella, and as mentioned in the bio, I'm doing my doctorate studies in political studies at Queen's University in Canada. I'm also the head of diploma for the newly implemented Comparative Politics Diploma Program at Spring University, Myanmar. I'm originally from Myanmar and moved to the United States as a young teen, and I have been living and working in Canada since 2017. I started getting involved in Burmese political activism as well as in the Canadian Burmese diaspora around 2017 as well. I was in the United States growing up, but when I was a young teenager, I didn't keep up with the diaspora community. So moving to Canada and doing graduate studies in my homeland really strengthened my ties with the Burmese diaspora all over the world, as well as give me an opportunity to give back to the youth in Myanmar who want access to higher education, particularly after the coup when the public university system was disrupted by political violence.
Perfect, thank you. Actually, one of the reasons I brought you onto the podcast is because I believe you kind of represent a generation that is, there are first generation migrants and then there's second generation, third generation. But, like coming to move to the United States or move to Canada at a young age doesn't really make you one more than the other because you have sort of an experience in both countries. So why don't you tell us about your life that you remember in Burma when you were a kid? Like where did you live in Burma? What was life like?
So that's a really good question. I feel like sometimes I am neither first generation nor second generation. I have cousins who were born and raised in the States and, they fully identify being American, have no qualms about putting their American identity before the Burmese identity. And my parents were very traditional Burmese. Although my parents, they came from the Mon and Karen backgrounds, they were still very Burmanized growing up. And then when they moved to the US, being first generation immigrants, they kind of double down on the Burmese identity and they went to all the events at the temples, at the churches, wherever there's Burmese community, they're there, right? So moving to the States in my adult sense, I read an article about the generation of teenage migrants from their homelands to the Western countries. And there's a concept called the 1.5 generation. So you are neither the first generation or the second gen, you are in the middle. So you share experiences with both, but your positionality is unique. So I really wanted to thank you for bringing up and acknowledging this experience. I forgot the name of the scholar who coined the term, but I really appreciated it because when I read about it in my master's studies, I was like, oh, this is it, I know the generation that I belong to. So going back to the question, talking about my life in Burma before I left, I was the youngest daughter of two in a middle-class family. My dad worked multiple jobs to support our family. We have a very traditional family home where multiple generations, at least 3 generations, were living in the same house. And my dad was the main supporter of both retired sets of grandparents as well as his children, his wife. my mom. So we grew up in Insane, which is a large part of Yangon, but kind of far from downtown Yangon. So it would be like the suburbs in American terms. And my mom ran a little pharmacy in our neighborhood, and my sister and I went to public school. And of course, after school, I remember having to attend even more classes. I think for Canadian Burmese kids, it would be like Kumon after school, but we have something called tuition classes where you go to friends' houses and learn, study extra. So we did that. So that was pretty typical. But what was the outlier is that I was quite talkative as a child, and I always wanted to go in and listen to what the adults are talking about. And my dad, he is very interested in politics, but he wasn't politically active due to the fear of persecution. But he always had BBC, VOA, IFA on his little portable radio. So I would go in and be like, Dad, what are you listening? Who are these people they're talking about? So I always wanted to learn about politics and foreign governments since I was in elementary school. And back then, people in Myanmar, they couldn't talk about politics at all in public. And even in private, you have to be really careful in case if there's anyone around who might alert the authorities, because persecution of politically active citizens was very common practice. So I do have to thank my late father for taking me to old booksellers in Pennsylvania, downtown Yangon, so we could find some old books about politics and international relations. Sometimes we pay good money for it, and we will hide the books in our house at the bottom shelf of the bookshelf, and then we will read it together when there's like no one that's not our families around. And he also took me to visit his friends who were former political prisoners so that I could listen to their courageous stories and how they did political activism back in the 60s. So by the time I was 9, I heard a lot of these stories, and this really inspired me to decide my career trajectory. It was a really young age to be deciding this, but I thought that, hey, I wanted to become a diplomat like U Thant. For those who don't know U Thant, he was the first Asian Secretary General of the United Nations, and he's from Myanmar. And for the whole UN, he was the third Secretary General.
Well, what year could were you a kid in Myanmar for our listeners?
I was 9, so I believe it was around 2003 or 2004. That's when I decided I read a few books on U Thant's biography, and I'm like, hey, Dad, that sounds really like such a cool job. He got to meet all different presidents and have influence on, stopping wars, because it was the time when Cuban Missile Crisis was really, really heightened, and he played a key part in stopping this potential nuclear war from happening. So I was very impressed, and I said like, hey, I wanted to be like him. So that was early 2000s.
Yeah, yeah. I came across that story too, and when I saw that, I was like, when you read about the Cuban Missile Crisis, nobody remembers the Burmese guy who, was part of, how things ended up, and the world didn't end, in part because of that.
Exactly. Mhm.
I find it the reason I asked about the year that you were a kid in Burma was because um, it seems like you did grow up during a time when understanding politics was beyond taboo. It could be straight up illegal, right? You were hiding books and you didn't want people to know.
Yes, exactly. It was very taboo and illegal. And sometimes now that I think about it, I'm like, my dad did risks a lot, even going to Pennsylvania with me, finding these books, letting me talk to political prisoners, because like he put a lot of trust in my interests, and respected me for being interested in politics, even though I was a girl in a traditional family. So
Hmm.
that's kudos to him. I'm where I am today. And it was really also funny because I will be reading the books at home when I was in grade 1, grade 2, grade 3 about U Thant and all this stuff. My dad helped me read a lot, of course, because my English and Burmese, they were both not that great at the age. But um, I remember my elementary school too, because I grew up under the reign of Senior General Deng Shui, who was the former dictator
Mm-hmm.
of the previous military regime. So, and then there was a general named U Kenya, and he was very popular. He visited a lot of schools, and I remember when I was in grade two, he was doing a he was doing like a tour in those fancy cars, and he stand up, from the sunroof, and he waved at the kids. So he was gonna do that in the neighborhood that we had our elementary school in, and I had to go into school at 5, 6 a.m. And all the other kids were there. We were like 5, 6, 7, 8 in ages. I was like 6 or 7. We had to go there. We had to stand like next on the pavements, and we had to wait for 2.5 hours before they showed up, and we had to wave in unison, and we have to wish them well. Some of the kids that are deemed conventionally pretty or cuter, they were given flowers and have to give
Oh
flowers to the
no.
general. It was very wild. It was normal. My mom, before she became a pharmacist, she worked at a government factory too as a factory worker. And whenever a minister or a general comes, everyone has to dress up and give them flowers and wish them well. So that was just a part of, our normal life. Didn't think much about it. And when I moved to the States, I'm like, no one does that here, And now people talk about things like that happening in North Korea in memes because internet became big in 2010. And so I'm like, oh my God, that is what they do in North Korea. That is what I did when I was a child. I just thought it was normal.
Leading to that, what was life like when you moved to the US? How did that happen? What year did you move in? Why and how did you grow up?
So, my aunt from my dad's side, she moved to New York City with her husband and her kids in the 90s. They were sponsored by her husband's brothers and sisters who were there in the 80s. So there's a program in the US where when you become a US citizen, you can sponsor your siblings, right? So I don't family sponsorship program it is called, I believe. So my dad sponsored our family in 2006, and that's how we migrated to the US. I think Canada is something similar called Family Reunification Program. So something like that. So my aunt sponsored all her siblings in 2006. So that's how we started our pathway to migrating to the US.
And
So
what was life? Oh yeah, go ahead.
go ahead. Yeah. I was just gonna confirm the question.
Oh yeah, so what was life like growing up? What age were you when you came to the US?
So when we got sponsored to move to the US, I was about 11, almost going on 12. Growing up in the US as a Burmese youth was quite challenging for me. Whenever I was living in New York City with my family, it was okay because we have family in Brooklyn and Queens, which
Hmm.
both of the boroughs are known for having a lot of, Burmese community. So whenever I was in New York City, I was fine. But I was a rebellious teenager, and I decided that after I finished my SATs and it was time for me to submit the common application, go to college. I was like, well, it's boring. I do have a big extended family with over 20 cousins, and everyone was in New York City or New England area, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. So I just don't want to be with around my cousins or family anymore. I was 17, and I'm like, you know what?
Hmm.
I'm gonna move to the West Coast alone. I'm in college, I can do it. So I moved to Oregon alone, and my whole family's like, you can just live with family in Queens. Like, if you don't like Queens, why don't you move to Brooklyn? You can even go to Boston. I just was set on the West Coast. So I was
Hmm.
like, no, I don't want to live with family. I'm a grown person, 17 literally was a child, but I thought I was super grown up. So I moved to Oregon alone to attend university. I accepted an offer from a small liberal arts college in Oregon, and the college it was in a small town called McMinnville. So it was about 2 hours drive away from Portland, I believe, an hour 45 minutes, 2 hours. So Portland itself is somewhat diverse back in the day. So the year was 2013 when I started college. But then McMinnville was a totally different story. It was more than 90% white American population, not a lot of diversity at all. So within the first month in Oregon, people asked so many ridiculous questions to me, and those people are not. These questions came from both the older generation, like university staff and professors, but they also came from younger generation, like teenagers, people in early 20s like me. So like, like me who were going there for college, people ask so many ridiculous questions every time I spoke up, like, why is your English so good? Why don't you have an Asian accent? And, you know, some people, when they see my face, I go into shops or
Hmm.
I go into like local community, they will just say like, how are you? It's
And this is in
very, very,
Oregon.
that was in Oregon. Yeah, it's very cringy,
Wow.
but they would just like slow everything down. I'm like, I can speak English just fine. Like, you don't have to slow it down. So they got double the shock when they see me. They slow down their English, and when they find out I can speak English just fine, they also didn't want to believe that either. So it was just jumping through a lot
Wow.
of hoops just to exist daily. And then one time, a guy in my class, he asked me if there was electricity in Myanmar when I was growing up. I was like, what? And he said he thought that people in Myanmar lived in huts and in the swamps, in the rivers with no electricity and like, eat everything from the wet markets. And he didn't
Mm.
keep the thought to himself. He just had to let me know about his thoughts in public. So that was the first time I was like really experiencing culture shock because I never experienced this like these
Hmm.
type of questions and ignorance when I was growing up in Rangoon, and then when I moved to New York City, like there were no questions like that at all. I was pretty sheltered. So Oregon became the place where I started reflecting a lot on my own identity, what it means, what my community means to me. So Oregon, in a way, it was like, it was a kind of like a place where my political activism and social awareness was galvanized.
So, how was learning politics in Myanmar different from learning politics in the United States, if it was?
So we didn't actually get to learn political science or um, anything adjacent to it in public school in Myanmar when I was growing up, because as we discussed before, politics is very taboo and we're not allowed to talk about it in public. But I do remember that we had history as a subject in elementary and middle school. And whenever Myanmar was having bad relationships with its neighboring state, Thailand, this little green textbook comes out. We have to buy the textbook, but you don't have to study from that textbook every year. It only comes out occasionally, right? I was in elementary school. It was green and very thin, and it says specifically Myanmar, Thailand relationships on Myanmar, Thailand history. And then you have to memorize pages upon pages when you're in elementary school how Thailand is a bad political actor, how the Burmese kings are so much better. They have so much more pone, which is rough translation. Pone would be men have pone. That means these men are powerful and these men are to be respected. So yeah, the books hypes up the Burmese kings a lot, and it talks in such a proud way that well, Thailand, we were able to take over Thailand and we're able to kill off their royalty. We're able to bend down their city. But, doing all these is very awful. Warfare is very awful, but the textbook phrases it in such a way that the Burmese military, Burmese kings were better, the Thais were lesser, so we won them, we beat them all the time. You should be proud of our kings, right? And we were really young children, elementary school age, having to memorize that, and we have to sit for the exam asking the question, oh, why were the Burmese kings better? Like, tell us about how successful they were in terms of warfare and conquering Thailand, and you have to write down whatever you memorize. You cannot even paraphrases. You have to write down everything you learn. The Thais are bad, the Burmese are good, we are conquerors. And the more you can memorize and write down, the more you buy into this ideology, the better your grades are gonna be in this subject. And when I grew up and I started studying political science and international relations in the US and later in Canada, I learned that, oh, actually, well, I cannot speak about elementary school in the West, but when I specialized in these subjects in college and in graduate school, Even when you are studying Canadian politics, because that's what I did in Canada for my master's degree, you can still criticize the Canadian government even when you're learning about Canadian politics at a Canadian university. Of course, you don't go accuse people of things, without citations, but if you have citations, if you have evidence, you can point out what the government is doing is not right for marginalized people. And, you can give out policy recommendations. And you can also read on different books and different sources and different authors in a lot of different publications. Whereas I remember when I was learning about the Thai Myanmar relationships in Myanmar, it was only one textbook and you have to memorize word by word. And you have to, as a child, you get brainwashed somehow. And I thought, oh, the Burmese kings are great, the Thai kings are weak. But now that I think about it and I read about it again as an adult, and I'm like, oh, actually, these are very fabricated, exaggerated history instead of facts. So that was really humbling when I, started figuring out how brainwashed as children we were, thinking the Burmese rulers, particularly the kings and the military rulers, are the best, and the rest of the world, they suck. So that's what the education system was offering when I was young.
What would happen if you brought some critical critiques? Let's say like you told the teacher, like, what if like we think a little bit differently about Thai Myanmar relations?
You know what? No one in class. I think I had to learn the Thai Myanmar relation textbook for 3 or 4 years when I was in Myanmar, because those are the years Myanmar and Thai governments were having some type of tension. But no one really questioned what happened in these books. My parents tell me at home that, oh, they are making you take this extra subject again because, the Burmese and Thai government are not getting along
Mhm.
well. But I was always advised both by my teachers and my parents, like, if you want to get good grades, you have to memorize word by word and you have to write everything back down as in the textbook. Like, you don't have to understand it, you don't have to question it. If
Wow.
you want good grades, right? So write word by word. I remember paraphrasing 3 or 4 sentences because I didn't want to memorize. I was lazy. And I just wrote something very generic down. Oh yeah, the Burmese king conquered Thailand. I didn't put in like how great he was enough. And I remember I was docked like 5 or 10 points for that. Because you
Oh
have to actually
no.
write like how many battles he won, how many white elephants he has. So you have to actually detail his victories. I was just like, yeah, he won Thailand. He took over the city of Ayutthaya. And then I just wrote down whatever I remembered and I didn't get full marks.
Wow, you had to like put down like how many white elephants he had and things like that.
I remember learning about the white elephants. I remember learning in that textbook that some of the wars actually happened because of you know, some king wanted more white elephants than the other king because apparently back in the days, the Southeast Asian
Mhm.
kings, they think that if you have a white elephant, then somehow your powers are stronger. So so you have to learn about the white elephants too, which is, now that I think about it, a little bit childish. I personally think it's very funny now that I look back on it. But when I was young, it wasn't funny. I couldn't remember how many elephants, and I think I got like a much lower grade than other students who remember. So I got scolded at home.
But in a way, by getting lower grades, you are actually challenging the system. So maybe you can take that lower grade as a mark of achievement.
Exactly. Now I can wear it as my sense of pride.
Just like a side question, do you think that this way of like understanding politics in Burma in the past, when you grew up, like specifically things like Thai Myanmar relations, had an impact on actual Thai Myanmar relations?
I don't think it actually had an impact on the time in my relations, but I it's not my expertise, so I cannot expand
Hmm.
more. But what I know is that in elementary school and middle school, a lot of my classmates and I personally, we had this sense of superiority. Right? I was like 6 or 7. Why did I feel superior compared to the other Thai kids? Because I was like, oh, we're better. We want
Um,
your country, our king conquered your country. But now that I think about it, I'm almost 30. I don't, I've never been to Thailand. I don't have any close Thai friends. I'm like, well, I was 6 or 7. I was even like, I only went to school and home and play in my neighborhood. That's about it. But I still somehow felt like, oh, I'm better than the Thais, which is very ridiculous. So I'm now that you asked me about it, I'm quite concerned how this type of false feeding information might have impacted a lot of school age children. The younger you are, the more susceptible you are, right? So I'm really now concerned how many, young people who had to learn this false information in school are going around still thinking like, oh, we are better than our people from our neighboring countries, just because what they learn at such an early age. So I do think that there might have been some psychological impact for some people.
yeah, that is a big concern. I think the way we get educated definitely changes our political beliefs. Like, I mean, it changes it right there. Let's fast forward to some of the work that you're doing right now with Spring University. First, can you tell me what Spring University is and its purpose, and what do you do with them?
So with the Spring University, um, in 2020, a few months right after the coup took place, I started out as an advisor to the former director of the Institute for Human Rights and Democratic Government, IHRDG, at Spring University, Myanmar. The former director, Anders, has become a wonderful friend and colleague over the years. And then in 2021, I volunteered as a guidance counselor for IHRDG students. And back then, in 2021, Anders and I, we often talk about how can we better the access to higher education for students who are affected by war and conflict in Myanmar. And then we came up with this idea to implement a new diploma program on comparative politics. We co-designed the program, and then this year in February, we were able to kickstart our very first term. We have a cohort of wonderful students, many of whom are internally displaced people or refugees who would not
Mhm.
have access to higher education otherwise. So this is, my brainchild. I'm very proud of it, but more important than that, I'm very proud of the amazing interest from the students in learning about the politics of their own country, even when the country is in such turmoil. They come into the class always ready to learn, and they always try their best to apply what they learn theoretically about comparative politics and then apply it in real life to contribute to the democratization, to promote peace, to promote activism against the military junta in Myanmar.
And for context, Spring University was formed because the after the coup, a lot of the universities, I think every public university was shut down, either by the government or because CDMers did not want to participate in a system that was pro-junta. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So the coup happened, and a lot of universities, and most famously featured in the news coverage back then, medical university, pharmacist
Mm-hmm.
universities, and then law school. So a lot of the famous university, but like basically all the public universities and colleges, a lot of students rallied and protested. A lot of professors joined them. There were a lot of arrests, a lot of havoc going on. So universities were shut down for a few months just because there was no one going there, and there was also political turbulence. And then the government started forcing people to reopen the universities at the full scale, and there were some university professors who unfortunately did not side with the pro-democratic students, so they went back to teaching. And some people, due to different circumstances, right, they figured out, or for them, it is worth it to get an education for whatever reasons under the junta. So the university started opening up again. But then Spring University came in when the universities were not functioning at all, because we figured, this conflict might become protracted. And as a result, thousands and thousands of youth in Myanmar might not have education
Hmm.
might not have access to higher education, which is a human right, and we cannot let that happen. And also having somewhere to go and learn, you know, give the youth who are very busy risking their lives doing political activism, also gives them a sense of normalcy. They get to be youth again, talking to other youth in class, and they get some type of university life, even though it is online. So it gives them some purpose to um, look forward to after a
Hmm.
very long day of doing very difficult things.
Uh, so correct me if I'm wrong, the model of Spring University is that a lot of these classes, various programs, every program you could possibly create with the resources you have will be developed with the courses and the materials. You'll have professors, TAs, students enrolled in these courses, and it's all taking place online. Um, how has this kind of model been working for you? Do you have you been like facing challenges, or have you seen challenges in how it works, and how do you see it advancing going forward? Especially as you mentioned, this if this revolution is protracted, you people need to be educated, right? People need to be educated for the future and for the advancement of themselves and of Burma itself.
So most of the challenges that are imminent, they are infrastructural and financial. So for instance, like you said, Spring University, Myanmar is an online university, right? So all the students, they need to have regular access to stable internet to participate in classes and to obtain their degrees. However, lately there have been very frequent electricity cuts in Myanmar, even in the big cities
Mm,
like Yangon and Mandalay, and internet shutdowns happening all over the country. And these are compounded with natural disasters like flooding. So attendance has been pretty low across the board in different programs under Spring University Myanmar in recent months.
How do you envision or hope things would what do you want Spring University to look like, ideally?
Well, ideally, the challenges I mentioned, they are very acute. They are very situational. So, there are ways that we can work harder and improve things. So I'm okay with that. But ideally, what I want Spring University to look like is to become a university recognized by international colleges and university. Because right now we have MOUs, partnerships with a few foreign universities, including some in the US, some in Thailand, and a lot of the other university MOUs are in the talks. But let's say you get a diploma from String University, it's all taught in English by faculty members from the Western countries. You have the diploma in hand, but okay, this student want to move to Thailand, and if the employer is gonna ask, do you have a degree? He's like, yes, here it's my degree from String University, Myanmar. They're not going to recognize it. They're like, oh, you have no
Mm,
degree, you drop out of university, Yangon University, first year. This is just an online university, so you'll have to redo all your studies from scratch in Thailand. And a lot of people don't have that type of resources, so they
hmm.
might not have a job. So I think accreditation is the thing I want to see the most from String University Myanmar in the future. We want all our diplomas to be accepted as valid and legitimate by a wide range of other universities and colleges across the world.
Sounds like a vision I also agree with. Like people are everywhere now. People are in Thailand, people are in Bangladesh. People's education just got chopped in half. 1 year left or 3 years left, or people who are trying to go to university or college in Burma. I've talked to a few of them in Thailand, and um, to be honest, they say that like their lives have just been like screwed over. They've had like visions of becoming engineers, doctors, and the coup just stopped that. So I really appreciate the kind of work that Spring University does for a lot of these students. It helps them continue and develop that educational interest. Um, and with those MOUs, it looks like it actually is going to lead to further education or other pathways. So I really hope that that does work out. Let's switch gears and talk about your doctoral studies and your area of study. So tell us about your ongoing work.
So, full disclosure, I am currently on leave from my doctoral studies for the rest of the year. My father recently passed away, so I'm just taking some time with my family.
Mhm.
But I will go back to university in January next year. So, it will be my fourth year of PhD in political study at Queen's University, Canada. I in my department, you have to have a major field and minor field for your PhD. So my major field is in gender and politics, and my minor field is in comparative politics with a focus on ethnic politics. And the dissertation, it focuses on, like we said in the introduction, how contemporary authoritarian regimes, their powers, how it is being both contested and sustained through social media channels like Facebook, TikTok, Telegram, Twitter, etc. And I also look at, okay, the contemporary authoritarian power is being contested and sustained through social media, but this whole process of contention, it is also gender depending on who the activists are. The whole social media activism scene, it can shift a lot. Your experience can vary depending on your gender, so I also look at that as well.
I noticed specialization in your work on women, peace, and security. So, like all revolutions, all conflicts, all wars, women play a integral role, despite not being on the posters and on, the faces of news articles, as the leaders or revolutionaries. Women play a role in civil society, humanitarian responses, political activism. They do make up the bulk of the victims in conflict. But I would say that, and you can correct me, that women in this conflict also do play a role different from others. Is that uh, they're a huge part of the makeup of armed groups, specifically People's Defense Forces camps. There are a lot of numbers. The pictures of a lot of young women fighting on the front lines is uh, a growing theme in this revolution, and I've always had a lot of questions and thoughts about how that um, plays out and what the kind of scholarship or work is. So why don't can you tell me a little bit about your thoughts on how that has happened and what's going on?
So I totally agree with you. Traditionally, women have just taken this support role, stayed, in the offices, do the admin stuff, and mostly they have been marginalized in civil society and revolutions. And the poster child is always a man leader. And I also agree with your observations that lately we see a lot more young women in uniform in the PDF forces social medias, and we're like, oh, this is new because growing up under the military dictatorship, there were giant parades, people walking around in uniform and stuff, but it's always men, and women are the ones offering them flowers, offering them,
Hmm.
support. So that is what we saw growing up in Myanmar. So this is definitely a huge shame, and I do welcome that the society is opening up a lot more, and the PDFs and forces are willing to take the women in for membership, because this would not have happened. I haven't seen that happen this commonly in previous any armed conflict before in Myanmar's history. But one thing I also wanted to note is that I do work with a lot of grassroots women who are doing activism within Myanmar, and a lot of my contacts, they are in PDF forces. They are active members, so I talk to them a lot. And about about I would say 80 or 90% of the women I talk to who are PDF members, they say that, oh, yes, we are in the PDF, but we are not too happy with the role assignment we get. Yes, they give us uniform, but then, sometimes some groups they don't get as much support as other groups. So when they buy arms and they only get a few guns or a few arms, those would go first to the guys who are trained and not to the women, right? And some women, particularly if they have background in healthcare, they will be like, okay, you would be the healthcare team member. You are still a member of PDF, but you would be nursing the man back to health. Or like some younger women, they will be like, okay, we will train you, but most of the time you will be in the support role. So yes, they are in the front line, they're in the battlefield, but they are cooking, they are bandaging up people
Mm.
who are wounded. Most of the time, these wounded soldiers and men. So yes, there are a lot of PDF women, and some PDF women do get to fight, but a lot of them, they still don't get to fight at the same level as their male counterparts do. So I really wanted to bring up their frustrations and amplify it through this podcast. Yes, there's representation going on. This is very new for Myanmar, a huge leap in terms of women's participation politically. But at the same time, even within the PDFs that accept women, there's still patriarchal beliefs influencing how the environment functions on a day-to-day basis.
Why do you think that is? Uh, just kind of trying to understand uh, the kinds of roles that people place women in. I think Burma is an interesting example because it is one of the first countries that put sort of a woman as like a figurehead. Aung San Suu Kyi, way back before it was kind of normal to bring women leaders to the forefront. But even then, there are still issues back then of kind of the kinds of words that were being used to criticize her, and um, the criticisms later on became more justified, but the gender-based ones obviously did not. Um, why do you think that women get this kind of discrimination, even like on the battlefield?
So for Daw San Suu Kyi, I think, yes, she's Western educated, she's very eloquent. She became basically the de facto leader of Myanmar when she was assuming her role of state counselor. But I think her charisma and her political legacy also help her a lot in securing this role, right? Because she is the daughter of General Aung San, who is one of Myanmar's biggest founding fathers, right? So she also had this political legacy. General Aung San, the daughter, carrying on his legacy, sacrificing her comfortable life in the West to help the people of Myanmar. So that is how she garnered a lot of support. This legacy helped her incredibly, combined with her own talents, of course, became the top leader of Myanmar, even though she was a woman. But even when she was the woman leader, if you look at the members of parliament when the NLD government was the ruling government, you still see that, okay, there's 25% of the parliament was mandated
Mm-hmm.
for the military members. So that's almost all men. And then the rest of the 75% elected officials, very few offices were won by women. So if you look at the parliament, upper house and lower house as a whole, you see that, you start to realize, okay, Daw San Suu Kyi, she is an exception, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not common. So yes, women do sometimes get leadership roles in Myanmar in terms of politics, but if you look at all the political leaders in Myanmar's history since independence, Daw San Suu Kyi is the only one who became the chief of state
Mm-hmm.
or, the state counselor. So I would argue that Myanmar, it might seem open to having women in top leadership positions, but if you look at statistics, it was still very patriarchal and ran by men, particularly men with military background who has a lot of financial resources. And I think since it has been like that post-independence, even before the military took over, the country leadership was still men, with Minister Unu and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And since 1960s, the military took over. It has all been male generals, very staunch conservative, um, super nationalist people running the country, right? So they their leadership styles for decades influence how the people think for the people who grew up born and raised in the country. So there has been patriarchy and militarism really entrenched in Burmese traditions for decades due to a result of this type of leadership. So yes, we are changing, but we cannot just like snap our fingers and be like, oh, okay, now we are fighting against the military, we are going against them. But that doesn't mean that everyone's just gonna suddenly become, you know, pro women's right, pro women's participation, pro
Mm-hmm.
equity. So it would just take some time. I think it is just an unfortunate case of very entrenched traditional roles that is impacting the participation of women in the PDF forces. And I do think that with time and the amount of self-educating a lot of the younger generation is doing, especially within the PDF forces, because a lot of the participants are youths. I am hopeful that the situations would change for the better for the women who decide to fight in the PDF, and that they will get an equal opportunity to participate politically in the way that they want to, not just limited to traditional roles like cooking and nursing.
Mm-hmm. Tell me about your vision for the future of Burma, future of Myanmar, or I think some people call it the new Myanmar.
Well, that is a really good question, a really tough one too. Um, I particularly don't have very long-term visions because I do work with the grassroots community right now, and a lot of the people I work on a day-to-day basis are refugees, political exiles, internally displaced people. So my hope for the near future of Myanmar is for Myanmar to become for the revolution to become successful and for Myanmar to have an elected civilian government and for us to just get rid of the military government once and for all. I do not want to see another military government ever again in my home country. And another hope I have is that for everyone who had to flee Myanmar because of political violence, there would be the right for them to repatriate successfully and safely and supported by the new civilian government after the revolution in Myanmar. Because I know there are probably up to a few million of diaspora individual, and a lot of us, a lot of them, they want to go back to Myanmar and live and work there. So I really hope that whatever civilian government that takes over when the whole revolution is over, these people are able to go back to their homeland and they will have access to citizenship, they will have access to equal rights, and they will be supported in every way possible to make their return a smooth journey.
Thank you. That's a great vision. How can people follow, learn more about, and support the kind of work that you're doing?
So if you want to support Spring University Myanmar, you can go to their website. If you Google Spring University Myanmar, it's the first search result. And there's a list of contact us email for different schools. So you can explore different diploma programs that we have, and you can get in touch if you have any questions or want to volunteer as a teacher or want to donate, some funding for us. Anything helps. And if you want to follow me to keep up with my research, I do both academic and public scholarship. You can check out my website, www.bellaong.com. I put a list of all my publications there. I really believe in open access to scholarship, particularly since I'm working on Myanmar. I do not think it is fair practice if I just write for my own publication record and do not provide access to what I work on. I think it's a very elitist way that a lot of Western scholars unfortunately do their academic work, and I don't agree with that. So whenever I publish, I put a link or I put a copy of my work on my website, so you go to my website and you can keep up with all the work that I'm doing both on Myanmar and just on anti-military and authoritarian women's activism in general.
Thank you so much, Isabella Aung, for joining us in today's podcast for Talking Burma. This discussion was really fascinating. Your story and your knowledge about what's happening, and also your ongoing contributions are amazing. So I would say keep it up, and I do recommend the audience please do support Spring University and the kind of work that Isabella Aung is doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That brings us to the end of the third episode of Talking Burma. Make sure to follow the Burma Canadian Association of Ontario on social media and subscribe to our podcasts on your favorite podcast streaming platform. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode.